Delighted to have on Outsiders. We've seen that the polls have collapsed for the Palaszczuk government. No surprise to me. I've been saying they're on the nose for a long time. I mean, do they like Adani? Do they not? Are they going to stop the protests in Brisbane? Are they not? No, they're a mess. The Labor Party were booted out in Queensland federally, so of course they'll be booted out at the next election, in my opinion. But who is the leader of the opposition? Deb Frecklington? Let's find out. Welcome to Outsiders, Deb Frecklington.
Good morning. Great to be on your show.
Good to have you here, Deb. Now, do you mind if we call you Deb? What's the official leader of the opposition of Queensland term? Will Deb do?
Deb. You can call me Deb.
Fantastic.
Look, but we've got, huge... Yeah, no, call me Deb.
So talk us through why Labor have collapsed in the polls and why people should be looking at you as the Premier rather than Palaszczuk.
Well, look, Labor under Annastacia Palaszczuk has allowed Queensland just to fall behind. We've got the highest unemployment rate in mainland Australia. Business confidence is at all-time low. We've got terrible decisions, which is meaning people aren't investing in Queensland. And yet we've got a Premier who is so weak. I've actually said she's the weakest Premier Queensland has ever seen. And the integrity crisis that is surrounding the Palaszczuk Labor government here in Queensland just goes from bad to worse. We've got the Premier's own Chief of Staff under a cloud of integrity, the Deputy Premier and Treasurer, a couple of ministers. It's all just... And yet we've got a Premier who's refusing to stand up to those integrity crises. But on the other hand, we've got myself and my team who have already put out our economic plan around busting congestion, cheaper electricity, making sure we get back to basics. I was just listening to that about education, declutter the curriculum in the schools. And most importantly, here in Queensland, our health system is a complete basket case. We've got a couple of hospitals on code yellow, meaning they won't even take patients. So we've really got to fix the hospital system as well. And I'm very focused on making sure we do something about water and regional infrastructure because, it's time we got back to, looking at what we can produce in this great state, whether it's resources or agriculture.
That's a big list, James. What have you got for Deb?
That's a small list.
So, Deb, or if I can call you Premier in waiting, if that's all right. So you mentioned they're busting congestion. One of the things that those of us in Sydney, and I think a lot of our viewers in the rest of the country see regularly, is Brisbane shut down on a daily or weekly basis by these Extinction Rebellion nutters, and that nothing seems to be being done about it. Under a government led by your team, what would you guys do concretely to make sure that the CBD wasn't locked down by these people who are gluing themselves to roads, and also that mines and agricultural operations weren't being threatened by this sort of behavior? I mean, understanding that legitimate protest obviously plays a role in a civil society, but, there's also people who need to get about their businesses.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And everyone's got a right to protest, but they really should be doing it with the respect of the Queensland people. And these current morons are not doing that. This week we actually had last week we had an ambulance that had to be diverted off a street. So now these people are putting people's lives at risk, and it's not good enough. So there's a couple of things. First of all, we've got to look at the process around why these people are getting permits to protest. And if they are getting them and they're continuing to be repeat protesters, what are the laws that we can slap on these people? So the fines, they're not just small fines. The LNP have already introduced a piece of legislation into the Parliament around our trespass laws, and these are to stop the jokers that are breaking into businesses like abattoirs and farming operations, and also jumping in front of coal trains. So we want to come down really hard. We've brought in, or we would like to bring in, tough new measures, really big fines. Organised trespass. So, for example, if you have let's say if it is an organisation like Get Up, and they are encouraging a heap of people to stop a coal train or break into an abattoir to stop a business, then we're looking at major fines of around $400,000. Not just a slap on the wrist, some major fines to prevent these idiots stopping people's, workplaces, but also endangering people's lives. I mean, Queenslanders actually have had enough of it, and I think that particularly Extinction Rebellion are not doing their cause any favours because everyone's sick of it.
Maybe quietly, you wouldn't be that displeased about these protests because, just like Bob Brown and his cavalcade of climate protesters through Queensland towns, I think they do enormous harm to their cause. So I think that they could only be helping you. But I wanted to ask you about the Queensland government's attitude to mining, because they seem to be all over the shop. Yeah. They seem to be very anti-mining before the federal election. Then suddenly they were very pro-mining. We had the Premier turning up in a high-vis vest and hard hat announcing that Adani's going ahead. And it's hard to read exactly where they stand. You've got Labor MPs in remote areas who seem to be very much in favour of it, and then those closer to Brisbane are very anti, almost as anti as the Greens. So where does Queensland Labor stand on the issue of mining?
Well, look, Annastacia Palaszczuk, this is another reason why she's the weakest Premier Queensland's ever seen. She's anti-resources, anti-regions and anti-jobs. Look at the debacle around the approvals process for Adani. 9 years. And this is a Premier who has flip-flopped, and no one will believe Annastacia Palaszczuk when it comes to resources industry in Queensland. Right now, we've got the New Hope expansion, a mine that has gone through the approvals process, done everything right. They've had Coordinator General approval since 2014, and yet they've had to come out on Friday to say if the Palaszczuk government don't get off their hands and give them a decision, 150 mining jobs on the Darling Downs will go. And it's just incredible. The whole community want this, and all of the environmental and financial concerns have been ticked off. And yet Annastacia Palaszczuk has said last weekend at the Labor conference, we're all for resources, but yet this weekend she's just completely walked away from it, and we've not heard hide nor hair from her, apart from popping her head up at the door of the Explorer Premier. I mean, what we need to see is a Premier that if she's going to say something, she backs it in. I mean, no one will believe Annastacia Palaszczuk when it comes to the bush and jobs.
I have some very worrying news for you, Deb. Apparently, Anthony Albanese has promised to come up to Queensland lots and lots of times. So, no doubt before the next election, no doubt he's going to change the thinking of the good people of Queensland. I doubt it somehow. But even worse than Albo is Wayne Swan. Now, I'll be talking about this later in Ice Age Watch, but Wayne Swan, the bloke who came up with much of the socialist agenda that allowed Scott Morrison to win the last election by showing what a joke Shorten was. Wayne Swan has come out and said, wait for this for a bit of hyperbole, Deb. He's come out and he said that sometime soon, not far down the track, there will be a dreadful climate event that will which will be as bad as the 9/11 terrorist attacks in New York. So he's compared some mythical climate event to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I think that's pretty disgusting to begin with. And he goes on to say it could well be on our own doorstep. So this is the mad extremist of climate change, which I think the people of Queensland rejected at the last election. But how can they be rest assured that your government in waiting is going to be stand up to this endless scaremongering and doom-mongering about climate change?
Well, first of all, that's the first time I've heard that comment, and it's absolutely disgraceful. It's actually despicable for a former politician to... so many people lost their lives in that, and I just think that's a disgrace, and it just shows how bad the Labor Party is. And if that's this left-leaning, well, it's extreme left-leaning here in Queensland Labor Party, good luck when they do come to Queensland and preach that sort of nonsense. But look, we've always put forward reasonable, sensible obligations for people, particularly, for example, when it comes to farming in and around the reef. All of the current reef regs, for example, that the Palaszczuk government have proposed are putting this massive onus completely back on the agricultural industry, where we know in Queensland that the best environmentalists are normally our agricultural producers. So, first of all, we've got to get Yeah, we've got to get back to basics, common sense pieces of legislation that don't just make it so much harder for people to get on and do what they are meant to be doing, which is running a business, employing people and keeping regional Queensland alive. And of course, that is why we will always prioritise the protection of and the healthiness of the Great Barrier Reef. And I mean, Susan Ley, the Federal Environment Minister, came out with some great statements in relation to that and what the federal government are doing in relation to the reef, just like we will here. But we're not going to let the scaremongers, you know, scare people off. And ultimately, Queensland is losing tourism numbers because of this moronic type of comments coming from people on a left government. I mean, we really need to be encouraging people to come and see this beautiful state of ours.
And
but
it is
under the Palaszczuk.
Yeah, it is, Deb, one of the most beautiful places in the world, Queensland. We love it dearly.